Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Inside Out Engineering Podcast. Today, I am chatting with one of my new friends, Chris Whaley. He is the founder and principal consultant of Escape to Expand, where he brings together people from really diverse backgrounds and disciplines to unlock their full potential. He has an engineering degree, which is why I'm obviously super jazzed to chat with him today, but he has spent most of his career in HR, over 25 years across consumer electronics, medical technology, and ultimately leading HR through business transformation, process improvement, organizational effectiveness, and employee engagement. So I'm very excited for you guys to hear this conversation. We talk about the hard stuff. And honestly, I know I probably say this about all of my episodes, but this is one of my favorite episodes. I love having philosophical conversations with people, and I love talking about hard things in a really nuanced way, because as much as engineers love to make things black and white, things are not always black and white. And so we talk a lot about that gray area. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear this episode. And yeah, so without further ado, let's get to it. Yes, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I am thrilled to be talking to you because we have so much in common, and you are in a space that I have lots of feelings about now. So I want to start the way I start with all of my engineering friends. I want to know your engineering origin story. How did you become an engineer? And then I want to know what you're doing with that degree now.
That's a great question. And I noticed you said you had a lot of feelings about, you didn't say there were good feelings or bad feelings. So I'm expecting a whole gamut here. So, but absolutely. So it's a privilege to get to be talking with you on this podcast and getting to know you a little bit better. Uh, yeah, my engineering background, it started when I was a little kid and Star Wars, the original Star Wars had come out. So dating myself a little bit, but I really love that, the story and the adventure and the science fiction elements. And so I also read a lot of science fiction growing up. So I thought, aha, wow, what's this great future that I can help build? And so I ended up going for my bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering, thinking I was going to work for NASA or a big airplane company. But about the time I was getting that degree, that whole industry was kind of collapsing a little bit. So I thought, well, let me broaden my background a little bit and went into industrial engineering for my master's degree. And that was kind of funny because as an aerospace engineer, we always called the IEs, the imaginary engineers, they're doing all the soft work, they don't have to take aircraft structures or fluid mechanics. But what I found out was it's actually the hardest work is making people and systems work, which doesn't always give you a right answer like a thermodynamics equation would. So I really kind of like making that move to broaden out that perspective a little bit. And I worked in a couple of different industries. I spent a few years as a crime analyst with the Knoxville Police Department, which was kind of a nice departure, but using the analytical thinking, but not really in a traditional engineering sense, but it was kind of a limited space that I could grow in. And so I eventually ended up doing a lot of project management work and data improvements, process improvements, again, kind of that engineering background using data to help make things better. But I started getting assigned to more and more HR projects and restructurings and things like that as a project manager to support our HR teams in the company I was with. And over time, I got to learn more and more about HR and ended up after probably about 10 years actually in HR roles. And my last corporate role was vice president of HR business partner. So it was not a journey I would have ever predicted going from, engineering background into HR, but it was one that I found really rewarding and that I still continue to love do today in my HR and project management consulting.
That's amazing. So that is the space that I have a lot of feelings about. And I don't know a lot of engineers that go from engineering to HR. And so thank you for kind of walking us through the whole journey there. I do want to hit on what you mentioned about the industrial space and that human element, because I also have the same feelings about industrial. They also, like at UT, they definitely called them the imaginary engineers. I think they still, unfortunately, call them the imaginary engineers. And I think, if I'm honest, it's because everyone is so jealous that Disney hires industrial engineers more than the rest of us. I think we're all just really jealous that they're actual Imagineers and we're not.
Yes.
So, and I love that in the industrial space, it does talk about the human experience more than any other discipline. So it sounds like that was something that was really formative for you, that kind of brought you into the HR space that is supposed to be, or we talk about it as like supporting humans. So you went from engineer to project manager, which I think that's also a common thing for those of us that have EQ and can like socialize with non-engineers, because it's really important for us to do that. So tell me more about what about HR kind of drew you in, because I know everybody has a different experience with HR. And it sounds like you have a very good one. So I want to know, like, what about it was so inviting for you and helped you feel like you were still serving all of the people that you cared so much about in your industrial space and in your project management space?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at the start, it was, as I said, it wasn't ever a plan. Hey, I want to work in HR. It was, hey, here's this big project we're working on that happens to be related to HR. And as a project manager, hey, that's something different. I get to work with a different group of stakeholders, and it's good to know people in HR. If figure out how people get hired and fired and who gets promoted and how those decisions are made. So, what's a better way to figure that out than to kind of get at least a little inside view? So there was, a little bit of, hey, I want to learn more about this because I don't know anything about it. But also there was a little bit of, that personal piece of, yeah, this is probably good stuff to know, earlier in my career rather than later. And so that was, starting off, it was more of those interest areas. And I think just the more I was in that space, on one hand, they were very welcoming because at least at that time, I think HR's come a long way in the terms of data analytics and bringing that structured approach where it wasn't so much there, 10 or 20 years ago. Still not maybe exactly where it should be, but uh, I was able to bring that data and process approach that not everyone in HR had, but they had that higher EQ. They had to be able to work with all these different people, and that's a skill we don't teach engineers. You either have it or you don't, but we don't. That's not part of the curriculum really, and that's, I think, also credit to what you do. And it's
Thank you.
so that there was that learning for me that I didn't really recognize, I think, going into it, that I was going to learn, that I did start to learn. How did these people being the HR professionals that had spent, decades doing this, how did they, deal with people they really didn't like, but, they still had to serve? Or how did they fire somebody if you had to, and how you did those very difficult things that I had never had to really deal with before.
Interesting. No, that's a really refreshing take, to hear that the HR team, one, like, cared about the data, about, and I wanna unpack that a little bit more. Like, I wanna know what kind of data are they looking for that you were able to provide, number 1, and then number 2, I would love to know what EQ looks like for an HR professional, because I do know that a lot of it is kind of navigating conflicts and being that confidant for some executive leaders, but I think that there is a I don't want to call it, maybe it is an internal conflict, that you are serving the organization first and a person second. So that, I think, is like the big thing I want to unpack with you. But first things first, so let's talk about the data. What kind of data does HR care about, and how were you as the engineer able to just bring that to the forefront and learn to speak their language?
That's, to me, that's kind of the aha moment a lot. And this was, before AI was around, and there's a lot of statistical tools, Minitab. So we had used Minitab, statistical analysis software for process improvement projects in a factory, or even within office, I need to move the paperwork faster. Let's do our process diagram and fishbone analysis, all the great engineering tools we might want to use for that. But on the HR side, they were used to sometimes pretty basic HR data. What's retention rate look like? Maybe we have some engagement scores. So there was, there's a lot of things they mapped and measured, but they weren't always drawing a lot of good insights out of it. And so one of the things I was able to help bring was looking at different data sources together and trying to say, okay, if we know that uh, we've hired these certain people into the pipeline, how many of those people ended up, becoming leaders later on, or other different perspectives of taking insights or creating insights from different pools of data that weren't necessarily connected before. And I think that's where it kind of starts taking, and that wasn't just because I was smart, it was because I had seen other people doing that in other places and brought it in. And I think that's probably my curiosities, that strength that helps me bridge in between those different skill sets, and that those aha moments. So for example, we had engagement surveys that we did, and so we had breakdowns by different data sets, like what organization do you work in? Are you male, female? What's your age range? Which of course were all um, totally anonymous to us as we saw the results, but we could look at aggregated data and look for trends. And one thing we saw was across the organization, we had very good ratings for people saying, I have a good opportunity to be promoted here, until you looked at senior leaders who were female. And primarily at the senior director and executive level, they were saying, I don't see the opportunities. Now, if they were a manager or they were early career, yes, they were saying, yes, I do see it. And they are getting promoted, and they're being happy about their career prospects, but they were feeling like there was a glass ceiling there. And so by looking at the different aspects of the data, it was able to help us find that aha moment. And then we could then go and do some focus groups and really dig in a little bit deeper. So it was that kind of analytical mindset around not just what's the number, but what's behind the number.
No, I appreciate the intentionality, right? Because I think that's where we can struggle with, well, now we have this data, what do we do with it? So it sounds like you guys were intentional about data gathering, and you bridge that human touch to it, right? Like, just because we have this data, and it is good to see that, we are checking in with our teams, but we want to do something. So I want to maybe unpack that whole engagement survey piece, because
Yes.
I've heard mixed reviews about engagement surveys. How how do you feel that we can really get a sense for what's going on in an organization if we're only checking in on them once a year, and then we spend a few months trying to unpack that data, because the questions aren't always specific. They try to keep, at least in my experience, they've been pretty general. So how do I even know that I'm going in the right direction, or I'm right, if there are a number of women that are saying I've hit a glass ceiling?
Mhm.
um what do you do with that data, right? Do you think that that's enough for people to take action? And are the questions written in a way that we can do something with?
Great questions. And there's lots of different ways that you can do engagement. It's not just necessarily a 60 question survey. The nice thing when you do a large scale survey as an engineer, then that gives you lots of data points you can analyze. You can look for those cross connections. Where are the correlations? Now, correlation's not always causation, as we know, but what data is correlated? Again, I can look at 60 questions and see people are answering highly here but lowly here. What's some common drivers for that? So there's something to be said for having those big great data grabs. Sometimes it just feels like that, but you also want to be able to keep that pulse. And so I've seen a lot of places where, doing sentiment analysis, or every day when you log in, there's, 5 or 6 smiley faces from the frown, to the happiest face. And you just do a very quick, on boot up, where are you feeling today? And so there's everything in between there, from just very quick kind of low level data gathering to, very comprehensive surveys. At the end of the day, though, there's really two things. And the first is, are you going to do something with the data? Because even if people are willing to tell you, how they feel, if you're not going to do something about it, then Nobody's going to respond. Nobody's going to care. So that's the first thing. If you're not going to do something with the data, don't even do it. The second part then is getting people to participate in the survey. And that's where there's has to come some trust. And a lot of times we use third party companies where we had an agreement, in the contract with them, and they said, hey, we will not give you individual people's responses. Even if you ask, we're contractually, obliged not to give it to you. So, there's legally no way that we could do that. And they would always say, okay, you have to have at least, 5 or 8 responses in any category before we will give you results for that. So there's some things that companies can do working with either internal or outside providers that can help put some kind of guardrails in place to make sure that anonymity is protected and help encourage people to take those surveys. And if you can get, you know, 10% as a start and people start seeing a difference, and then you get to 25 and 50, we'd gotten to the point where we were getting probably 80% plus, which is tremendous for engagement surveys. But it was because we would always, had a very short timeline when we would get the data back, have some hypothesis around things we were seeing at the hyper levels, but then handing the data back to the local teams and saying, here's what your groups are saying. What do you make of it? What you guys talk about with your team, and you come up with your action plan for what's happening at your level. And, higher up, we're going to look at things that are happening across the organization. So there was that sense of it's not just about collecting data, it's about driving an outcome.
No, I appreciate that as well because it is. People don't feel comfortable sharing their innermost thoughts if they know it's not going to go anywhere. And I've seen that in large companies, small companies. Like at some point, you just stop trusting that your leadership, quote unquote, cares about what you're saying. But I love what you mentioned about this like sentiment capturing because I don't think I've ever seen that in organizations I've been in where they are like capturing how you're feeling at like the start of the day. What is doing what do they do with that kind of data? Like, hey, if is it on an individual, like does it go to your manager and your manager's like, oh, my team's pretty happy today. Or this week, right? My team was great this week. What do they do with that information at that level?
Well, the ones I've seen have they're always still aggregated, so you keep that anonymity, and it usually is, wow, why is this organization or this group of people or this demographic, why are they all hitting this low at the same time? Is it the whole organization? Is it just specific groups, or is it just that one person's always scoring low? And of course, depending on cultures, there's some people that are never going to put it all the way happy, never going to put it all the way sad, even if that's where they really are. So there's a lot of different ways that you can read into that data, and it's looking at the macro effect, and again, what other data. If I know I've just announced a mass layoff, yeah, I'm not going to expect a whole lot of happy faces. If I just announced a big bonus, but I see a lot of unhappy faces, there's a disconnect there. So it's usually not just that data point by itself, but the other cues and those other sources of what's going on that can help fill in the blanks. And always there's an opportunity to reach out and say, hey, we're getting a lot of people that are scoring, down in this area. Is there some people that would like to come talk to us about it? Again, on an anonymous level. You can also, if it's something so bad that you don't even feel like you can talk to HR or your manager, you can bring in an outside consultant that can act as that kind of mediator in between, employees in the organization. Luckily, I've never been in a situation where we've had to do that, but I definitely hear about companies that, get in that space.
So you bring up a really important point about the trust in an organization, right? Trust of HR, trust of just the system in general. Because I know in my experience and a lot of just shared experiences with some engineers, we have kind of lost trust in our HR partners because it feels like they care more about the business than they do about me. And I think it was a hard lesson for me to learn very early in my career that HR was not there for me. They were there to protect the company. And that's something that like my engineer brain just really struggled to reconcile because I was like, well, companies won't exist if you don't have people in them, right? Like obviously AI is a very different story. But companies don't exist if you don't have people to run them and to do the work within them. So why wouldn't you care about the individuals? Why wouldn't you want to focus on giving them everything they need to be successful? Why would so m that I think that's my big question for you. How do you, especially as an engineer, like, how did you come to the reconciliation in your brain, and how do you approach it that makes it feel more human? Because I know we've talked a little bit about this, but I would love to hear more of it from you.
Yeah, it is a difficult spot, and I think that is what a lot of people don't realize is at the end of the day, HR, just like everybody else, works for the company. And that's a key role that HR plays is also protecting the company and the interests of the company. And I'm speaking here more as for-profit companies. Obviously you can have a little bit of difference if you're a nonprofit, but in general, that is a key part of HR's role. But it's also a key part of our role, and this is the dichotomy of HR, I think, that if we want to get the best out of people, we've got to treat people right. We've got to treat them with respect. We've got to develop people. We've got to give them those opportunities. So we also have to be people first. And sometimes, we might try to push, the people preference above, the not obviously we're not going to go into the legal precedents, but I always laughed when you talk to an employment lawyer. They're always the ones that are trying to protect the company the most, and so they're always going to be very risk averse. Hey, can we do this? No, no, no way. But is that legally illegal? No, we just would prefer you wouldn't. So that doesn't happen. So there's a kind of a continuum there, but absolutely you're never going to cross that line to something that's illegal. But that holding the balance of I'm doing the right thing for the employees and the right thing for the company, and it's not always black and white, and sometimes you do have to fall on one side or the other, and that's where it takes a lot of EQ to see what's really important in this situation and what's going to be the outcome. It's not always an easy choice. I think, when you and I had spoken when we first met, we talked about restructurings. That's something I had gotten involved with quite a lot. And at first there is that feeling of, oh, I'm helping people lose their job. It's in this part of my HR role. But I also saw this gives me an opportunity to make sure they are treated with respect, that we are following a process, that we do everything legally that we need to do and more, to make sure that we take care of people. And so that gave me a little bit of comfort to know that, the people are going to get laid off one way or the other. But if I can be involved, I can make sure, at least for my part, that we've done everything we can, and we've tried to match people to other jobs, or we're giving them uh, retraining efforts or whatever those other things we can do to make sure that we're letting go of them in the best way we can. So that was kind of, whether that was just providing solace for myself, but I truly believe that, helping, that transition, because it's going to happen whether I'm there or not, but maybe I can make it a little more bearable for some people.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of the people that you've made it bearable for, thank you. It means a lot when you know there is somebody in HR that does care about you as a human and is trying to do it in the right way. I know, I've also been a part of layoffs and restructuring, and when I have my HR business partners reach out to me and say, "Hey, can we find a home for this person?" Because like we want to lay them off as the last resort. Those are the things that, like, me as a hiring manager, I appreciate, because I'm like, okay, there's definitely good people. They definitely care about doing the right thing, not just, cutting losses and getting rid of people because they care about the bottom line first.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more about that gray area, because it is really, and I think we live in it a lot more than we like to think. So much of our corporate lives, I feel like we live in a little bit more nuance, that than we really give ourselves credit for. And I know for us as engineers, especially me, it was challenging to go from this binary, yes, there is a right answer, and a no, there's a wrong answer, to, well, there's something that's a little bit more right or a little bit more wrong. How did you learn how to just embrace the gray and get comfortable in that squishy space of not really knowing what the quote unquote right answer is, but it's the most right answer? So how'd you get comfortable with that?
I think there's two elements. So one is being surrounded by other people I respected in the field, especially HR that had been there and done that. So kind of learning from them. That doesn't mean they're always right, but at least hearing their perspective and what they had seen before and what they've seen work or not work or why they're making a certain decision, what risk they see. So to me, that's very helpful is talking to someone that's been there before or done that just to kind of help fill in my information gap. And then I would pull on my second piece, which is from engineering. It's basically risk planning and project management. What's the risk? What's the probability this bad thing's going to happen? And if it does happen, what's the impact? Also for positive, what's the probability this positive thing's going to happen and what's the impact? And thinking of it kind of as a risk matrix, not that I necessarily built it all out and filled all the numbers in, but taking that kind of thinking, is this clearly illegal or undoable? Okay, that's obviously off the table. Well, what we're left with is a continuum of choices, and then trying to take a bit of a scientific approach, leaning on the insights of others, but then also applying, whatever decisions that I had taken in the past and how they had turned out. I think it's just kind of a combination of all those things.
I appreciate when we can bring engineering tools into, like,
Yes.
the emotion space, especially, like, let me just lay it all out linear. This is how the thing I could possibly feel about the
Yeah.
situation.
And it's always easier to do, by yourself or but not in the moment. I'm not saying I'm that fast. I can do that in the moment always.
I'd like to think that I can,
Yeah.
but I don't know if that's accurate either. I'm very much one of those, like, delayed processors. Like, I will know how I really feel about something, like, sometimes an hour, sometimes a week
Mm.
later. It will take me a minute to, like, really process things. So how what's the pace of having to make these kind of hard decisions in HR? Because some of them, again, having been on the other side of it, sometimes it feels glacial, and I would love to know why. Is it because we're getting so much buy-in and you've got to spend like a ton of time just getting a bunch of different people's perspectives before you make an educated guess and or educated decision? And how what's the balance of this is actually an HR decision versus this is a people leader decision, but people leaders are just pushing it onto HR? So those are kind of two questions. So we'll start with hang on. Let me go back. I've already forgot my first question.
Yeah, but make sure I answer the right one.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Um, Decision time. Yeah, that's right. So sometimes it feels like from an HR standpoint, whether it's like through the hiring process or org structure shifting or rolling out new policies, right? Sometimes it feels like HR can take a very leisurely pace with some things. How I'd love to get some insight as to why it maybe feels that way, and maybe it was just unique to me and all the organizations I've been at, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a shared experience.
I think it definitely varies based on organization and situation. I've seen it move very, very quickly sometimes where your head's spinning, and I've seen it also shift to glacial levels. And a lot of times it falling back to project management, the stakeholder alignment. So, who's involved in this decision? If it's sometimes it's the CFO that comes down and says, "Hey, we need to save, $1 billion this quarter," whatever the number is. And the CEO says, "Yes, we need to do that." And it just lands in HR's lap to kind of help figure out and orchestrate. Um, and sometimes it's something the HR teams have done before and can pick it up very quickly, and other times not. So it really depends on the situation. If it's an international company, we have workers' councils, sort of like unions, but unlike unions and workers' councils, you present what you're going to do before it happens, and you have to get their approval and buy-in. So that can add to the process. There's always lawyers involved anytime you're dealing with people issues. And so, if you have in-house counsel, that's usually faster than if you're having to contract with someone outside. They can always have opposing views. Again, lawyers aren't always right. They may know what the far extents are of the law, but there's still gray areas in the legal side, and so they don't always agree. And so a lot of times it is aligning the stakeholders and getting that decision. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Go for it. And then there's mobilizing everyone around whatever that effort is. And then that is, unfortunately, HR is one of the most understaffed functions. There's more and more gets outsourced, and the HR business partners used to be, you might have one for every 100 employees, and now it's like one for every 250 employees in some cases. So it's thinner and thinner. We're relying more and more on your FAQs or your chat bots that are going to, which is great for, when do my healthcare benefits expire or something like that. But if it's how do I deal with my coworker that, keeps heating up, stinky fish in the microwave, whatever the thing is, it's the chatbots aren't always so helpful. So that that just the resource constraints. And one thing I learned was what the HR calendar was. So when is HR the busiest? And, if there's an engagement survey, performance review time, talent review time. So there's kind of places in the calendar where you're already stretched. And so you don't want to be picking up, new project or new work during those times. So yeah, there's a lot of things that can drive that perceived pace. And then sometimes maybe it's just you didn't get prioritized, depending on what the situation is. So hard to say, without getting into a specific situation, but a lot of things that can make that pace seem slower than maybe even what we would want from the HR side.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I appreciate the insight and the reminder of an HR calendar because I feel like every single department has a busy season and every
Yes.
department, every industry, like we've all got these cycles. But I want to pull on one thread that you mentioned, the idea of like going to HR when you're having an issue with a coworker. Because I won't lie, that's the last person I would go to if I was having an issue with a coworker. Because it kind of feels like tattletaling. And I know for me, I mean, granted, obviously this is a different situation because I teach emotional intelligence and I am pretty emotionally intelligent. So I know how to like handle conflict respectfully.
Mhm.
But I didn't always, right? I didn't, it's a learned skill, but I don't ever remember knowing anybody in my career, especially early on, that if I was having an issue with someone, their advice was, well, go talk to HR about it. Because if you went to HR, it was basically equivalent to tattletaling and now this person's name is on a list and now there's more of a stigma around going
Yeah.
to HR for something like, hey, I'm having an issue with a coworker, when it sounds like that's something they are supposed to be helping us with. So what kind of advice would you have for somebody to leverage to get comfortable with just building a relationship with their HR partners, and maybe getting comfortable with doing that kind of thing, asking for that kind of help without making it feel like they're tattletaling or putting somebody on blast?
It's a great, I'm going to say, conundrum, because if you don't have the EQ built up yet to say, is this something I should take to HR or not? How are you going to know unless you try it? Or you ask someone else, hey, what do you think about this? And you need to find it's somebody you trust, and that's where I think it is important that you have a mentor, whether that's your manager, it's HR, someone outside your organization, that you have someone you can go to and say, hey, does this seem like something I should take to HR or not? It can also be, in a conversation with your HR person, to say, hey, give me an example, what to you is something that, should raise to the level I come and talk to you. And the stinky fish in the microwave, that's a horrible example. That should not have to go to HR, hopefully. But, I had employees that came and said, hey, I think I'm in not, they didn't call it a hostile work environment, but kind of a step below that. I'm not feeling comfortable in this space. Okay, that's something I absolutely, need to be involved with in HR, not just because I care and I'm interested, but I'm legally obligated now to do something about that. We need to investigate and figure out, what's the story. And usually it's not just one story, there's multiple stories, and see, if there's some action that we need to take around something. And so that is the employee trying to figure out, is this something I need to take to HR or not? Yeah, if you're not sure, take it to HR and say, hey, I'm not sure if this is something I should be bringing to you. And if you tell me no, then tell me what resource I can use. And one of the things we actually did was teach people how to handle constructive conflict. Just, as you said, it's a learned skill. And so we found across the organization, we had some people that were, always, they didn't mind sharing the conflict they had. And then we had some people that, wanted to avoid conflict. And we wanted to kind of level the playing field that, conflict can be healthy as long as you approach it in the right way. And we're open to learning from others and seeing what our part in that is. And there's ways you can train people to do that. And of course, some are better than others, but it helped raise the bar in terms of how people could work together, still have conflicts at times, but empower them to deal with it themselves more often and call on us as HR less.
I think that's also a really important distinction you brought up about when you're legally obligated to do something about it. 'Cause I know when as a director, in organizations, I had, like, an HR business partner that I would talk to about things, and we'd become friends, and so there would have to be this, line of demarcation to,
Mhm.
"Hey, I'm just, sharing this frustration that I have," versus, "Hey, I'm sharing something, and now you're legally obligated to do something about it." And it's challenging to know what you can bring to HR because sometimes um, it can feel like you're making a mountain out of a molehill, but sometimes, right, it's important for us to go and talk to HR because maybe, we're the first person that's ever brought it
Yeah.
officially up, and other people have had this concern, but maybe we're the first ones that feel comfortable and safe enough to be like, "No, I'm gonna take action," or, "I want to do something about this." So is the level of legal obligation just a standard of this is the type of behavior that an HR has to legally do something about, or is it all dependent on the organization?
No, there are some pretty clear precedents. Obviously, if there's, hey, someone's discriminating against me, whatever way that discrimination is, there's lots of ways you can discriminate and lots of different factors you can use. It's not all just age, sex, or religion. There's lots of different ways. Then, hey, then that's something, I don't necessarily have to call the police about. I'm probably going to talk to my lawyer and we're probably going to, start an investigation of some sort. So there are some things, those red flags, somebody threatening another employee, either vocally or even physically. So there are certain things that should every time be prompting HR. And if HR doesn't do something and you're in a situation like that, just leave the company because I wouldn't, mess around there.
Yeah, well, so that's something that I want to talk about more because I feel like we have all been in an organization where there's a senior leader or several leaders that constantly exhibit toxic, hostile behaviors,
Mm.
and yet they are still vice presidents or senior vice presidents. And yes, HR has been notified of their behavior issues, and they may even have a rap sheet, and yet they're still in the organization. And you, who may have brought something up, are no longer allowed to be there. Uh, Can you make that make sense in my brain? Because it's something that I struggle with so much.
Yeah, so and that's where we've stepped from the legal into the gray area, and that what some people define as a toxic environment, others would define as a high performance environment in some ways, and I wouldn't always agree with that. But if you think of what's one of the most successful companies in the world right now, Amazon, and they're known to be very ruthless with employees in terms of the schedules, the amount of work they do, but the people that have worked there a long time, they love the company, and that's an environment that they thrive in. So again, it's what is toxic to one person is not always toxic to another person. If what type of, which sometimes, again, there are extremes where this is all, if I say you're an idiot, yes, that's, no matter what, they're going to be, I'm offended that you said that. But working across different cultures, I work for a German leader and very direct, going to always tell you what they think, but they also encourage you to do the same back to them. So if you didn't know that perspective, you think, wow, that was a direct statement, but very open for you to treat them the same way. So sometimes it's a difference in perception. Sometimes, though, that those bad behaviors that really are bad behaviors, not illegal, but you know could be seen as toxic, they can get results. And those leaders, the company then is saying, we value results more than we value people. And if that's a company you want to be part in, that's your choice. That's not a company I would want to be a part of. But there are those cutthroat environments. Uber was actually that way. When they started off, when they filed their IPO in 2019 to go public, they actually had to disclose that they called it their forward-leaning culture, which was, it started off a kind of meritocracy. If you did good work, you got promoted, but it turned into that toxic environment where the good people that were getting results were promoted regardless of how they got those results. And it devolved into, name calling, some threats of physical violence, even racial slurs within the culture. And so they actually had to call out in the IPO that continued culture could endanger their company. And so that is where you see where a group of people have said, hey, we don't care. That's the way we're going to be. As long as we don't cross that legal line, we're going to let that happen. So that's why it's really important to figure out what's the culture that you're comfortable working in, and using some things like Glassdoor. You can, get in and get a sense of, what people are saying about the company, checking LinkedIn and finding contacts that working at companies that you might be interested in. Ask them, what their perceptions are, because there is a whole realm of cultures that get work done. And if you're in one of those organizations that tolerates those types of leaders and you don't like it, there's not a real reason for you to stay there, because you're not going to change their culture. You're not going to be successful there. And unless they're doing something illegal, you're better off just to go somewhere else. And that's me. Other people may feel differently, but that's my perspective.
I appreciate that perspective, and I appreciate you making it make sense for me, because you really did just blow my mind for a second when you said what's toxic to one person is a high performing culture to another person. Like, my brain is actually broken with that, because we have so much research to prove that toxic tech, like textbook toxic, right? Abusive behavior, abusive language, demeaning, pushing people to work unnecessary hours, like it's life or death, and we're not in the medical field. Um, we have research that shows that is not a high performing culture. That is a fear based culture, and it has long term negative effects. You may get short term results, but it's not an actual high performing culture. So if we know so much, why do we still make that mistake? And why do we still allow those cultures to exist? Because you're right. We as individuals, we have the power to walk away. If you don't want that company and that culture to perpetuate, peace out. That company will no longer that company will cease to exist if we
Yep.
cease to work for them. So why aren't more people standing up and saying, you know what? No, I'm not interested in having this type of workplace culture continue to perpetuate.
My perspective at the end of the day, it's, to them, high performing is high performing financial results.
Mm.
And if you look, some of the terminology from, Jamie Dyson, return to office orders, you people, you're goofing off if you're not working in the office, and which I don't agree with. There's people that goof off in the office as well as people that goof off at home. It's where you're at doesn't determine whether you're goofing off or not. But you see, but they pay people very well. And if you get in that culture and you succeed, you get a lot of money for it. And so if you're willing to put up with that in exchange for money, and then they get good returns, and so their stocks go up. Even the employees may come and go, but there's a group of people that say, "Hey, I can bear this culture," and as long as they have that core percentage that stays with the company, then the rest can ebb and flow. So it is kind of unfortunate, and I agree. To me, that's not a high performing team. Using the definition you and I would use, it's which is, to me, it's that you're meeting your mission and building a personally engaging. That's kind of my mantra is, meet your mission, whatever your financial metrics are, whatever that goal is, but build a personally engaging experience for all the team members as well. And so that to me is high performing. But there's, Wall Street says high performing is, did you hit your numbers? And whether that means you laid off 50,000 people on a Zoom call, or you actually handled things the way you should, doesn't always make a difference. So I think that's kind of the harsh reality of all the leadership studies and everything else is, other things can work, and high performance isn't the only way to get results. Although I do think doing high performance the way you and I believe it is the most repeatable, sustainable, and honestly most honest and best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, look at Costco, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
They they are a pillar. They are a golden star when it comes to doing the right thing for your customers and your people. So it is possible. I
Yeah.
appreciate that perspective, and I agree with that definition wholeheartedly. I truly believe, because I we've seen it happen. There's so much evidence, and there's so many companies out there that do good, not only for their mission and their shareholders, but for the people that work there. Because it's such a short-term view to care about your stocks. And I get that, right? Like, we live in America. It's unfortunately, that's the capitalistic society that we live in. Um, but I still I feel like there's a better way. And I don't know if
Mhm.
this is just like Nikki's utopian perspective, right? I do believe that there's a better way for working and for living and for, providing shareholder value, but not at the cost of another human life and another human experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's one I even think about, using Amazon as the example. I'm an Amazon Prime member. We get lots of deliveries, but I mean, I've got the doorbell cameras, and you see when they make a drop off, they're running because, I mean, if you know any Amazon drivers, they're held to a very strict standard, and they don't walk slowly to your door. They're hustling, not for health, because they've got to do that or they lose their job. And guess what? I just bought, and am I helping them give them a job, or am I putting them in that situation? And the way I deal with that is, well, they chose to work there. That's their choice whether they work there or not. But at the end of the day, that's not the most, fulfilling job I can think that people would want to be running back and forth all the time. So, as a consumer, I'm voting to say, hey, I like that because I get fast stuff, I get cheap stuff, I get a wide variety of stuff that I need. But, you know, maybe somebody else is not having the best day because of that. And, I'm part of that system then. So do I decide I'm not ever going to buy Amazon again, or am I kind of complicit in it? So I don't have an answer for that, but it is, as you start thinking about, what's your role in all this as a consumer as well. Yeah, I'm not blameless myself, in that way.
Yeah. I think it's a fair moral struggle, because I think all of us really struggle with that, because we pay for convenience in some
Yep.
form or fashion. And it it is definitely something I know I ethically struggle with. Like, I'm not an Amazon Prime member because of all of these things.
I
It's
appreciate that then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also that person that, like, did not I'm not I don't enjoy shopping online. I love going and talking with people and engaging with them,
Mhm.
and, like, I love trying on clothes rather than just, like, buying a bunch of stuff and then sending it back. Like,
Oh,
the
yeah.
the logistics of that is a nightmare for my engineering brain. But I know some engineers that are like, "This is great. I never have to go into a store again." That's fine. Like, I love that for you. But it I because I s that whole aspect of is it really like, is it their choice, right? Or is this the only job that's available to them where they live in their area?
Mhm.
Or is there, you know, I don't know. Oh God, we could unpack like the moral conundrums of and the moral ambiguity of these types of like fast fashion, fast everything type companies. But I do think that there is like on the other side of it, there is some good that comes from these types of things because if you can order something online and it shows up at your house, it does allow you the gift of time. And that's what
Mhm.
I loved about like my old job in material handling. I saw it as me giving other people the gift of time to do things that are more
Yes.
meaningful for them. So like both can exist. Both like that's the challenge and that's just like the human experience of living in the gray area and just the contrast of it all. It can be both good and bad for you and for the people around you. Um but well thank you for playing like philosophical ethics with me for a second.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to go into to that topic, but it's that's where
You
we
know,
went.
it's fair. Sometimes these rabbit holes, they just guide us along the path. So the last question I have for you is for kind of going back to the EQ aspect of your work as an engineer and then moving into HR, because the fact that you and I can have this like nuanced conversation to understand both things can be true
Mhm.
requires a lot of emotional intelligence and confidence to know that it's okay that I don't have to reconcile them perfectly in my brain. Both things can exist and I can be comfortable with that. I don't have to have the right answer, and that takes EQ and just self-awareness and knowledge in general. So my question for you is how did you build these skills? Did you what resources would you give or advise people to tap into if they also wanted to learn these skills as well?
Well, I think mine came from a different path than probably you're expecting, and didn't expect it. Again, from the engineering side, we didn't, you don't really talk about EQ so much. But about the same time I was working on I think when I started my master's degree, I'd started as a volunteer firefighter for local fire department, and so had not did know nothing at all about firefighting. There wasn't any history of firefighting in the family, but where we live, we didn't have a fire department, and there was one starting up. So it was kind of like, okay, I can help the community, help make sure there's somebody there if our house catches on fire. But that's where I think I first started really learning about EQ and paying attention to the other person as well as yourself. Because one of the things as a rescuer you learn is you've got to take care of yourself first. Because and which is the opposite. You always think, the firefighter's running into the fire to save the child, which we're going to do it every time. I say I would have. It's been a few decades since I've done that, but we always train that if you don't take care of yourself, then you become a victim. And who is all the other responders? They're going to focus on the other firefighter or the other EMT or the other police person that's down first. They're the person they know. You just can't help but that's going to be a distraction. So you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of others and to make sure others aren't having to take care of you. And then you can focus on taking care of others. So I think there's a lot of ways you do that in the fire service, from the progressive training you do to the mentoring and coaching you get from others and just the experience of you just go out and things happen and you learn from it. So I think that's where I really started building my EQ. Wasn't so much from the engineering or even HR side. It was from the firefighting experiences I had.
That's so amazing and unique and so accurate because it also makes me think of like the aviation where like put your mask on first before helping somebody
Yeah.
else because you're no good if you're passed out. Can't help
Yeah.
anybody. But I love that because it is so it's more than just like taking care of your physical body, right? Like especially in a very high stakes life or death environment, your mental health is also really important. So it's wonderful that you were able to bring that self care long before we were talking about even self care as a word. And I know that like firefighters probably don't talk about it as self care, at least they didn't. And maybe they do now. That would be great.
Well, that's kind of the fun thing because I've been reflecting back on what I learned as a firefighter back then, which was almost 20 years ago, I guess. And now you do see meditation in fire departments and yoga and things like that, which you certainly never would have seen back then. And that's not all over the place, but what we did do was, which was really eye opening, the first time I experienced a fire fatality, and we had it in our department, we had a critical incident stress debriefing. So that was where they had a professional come in and talk us through as a group about our feelings. And firefighters are worse than engineers. You don't talk about feelings. How are you feeling? Oh, you're fine. But you know, sitting around in the circle, and you got these big strong men, and they're openly weeping, and that's not what you expect from that group. And outside that room, they'll probably never do that again, for the most part. But it did. I think that started showing, hey, you can have these emotions and feelings. How do you process them, and how do you deal with them? And it's okay to recognize that people can feel differently about the same thing and move at different paces. And so yeah, it was really eye-opening to me to experience that kind of an extreme situation, and then that makes a layoff a lot easier than dealing with a dead body. So that also kind of helps put things in perspective sometimes.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's important to know that those feelings are okay, even if they're, even outside of the space. Maybe I hope that they are still comfortable crying outside of that space and that hard experience. But so firefighting was a huge catalyst for you to develop these skills. How have you maintained them? And what are some either books, podcast tools, resources that you would share with the listeners if they wanted to continue to level up their EQ as well?
Well, one area I've grown in more, and it kind of reflects back on that as well, is I'm at, I already revealed kind of my age a little bit, but most both of my parents have passed now, but we've got to deal with those aging parent issues, and hearing and learning from other people that were caregivers as well, how important it is for caregivers, whether you're a mom with three kids, or you're a kid that's taken care of your mom and dad, wherever you are in that space, that you have to take care of yourself. And there's so many resources out there. And I love using like the Calm app and other things for me to help, for centering. And for me, it's also then how I redirect my energy. So it's you build the energy, but then what are you spending the energy on? And so this is one of the things I love, being on podcasts, and definitely enjoy this topic of EQ and EI. It's one that's going to separate people from AI, and people who are good with AI, but they're not good with EI, they're going to falter. So if you have EI and AI, I don't, maybe EIEIO, we can figure it somewhere. But, bringing all those elements together is something I'm curious to learn more and more about, because the AI is getting pretty good at spoofing emotions, but it doesn't know emotions.
Yes.
It can simulate, but it's not the same. And so, and who knows, that may change in another 5 years, but
No, I
I
I
don't think
refuse to believe that. I refuse. It's actually something I've talked a lot about lately. I don't think that that AI can replace this, like
I agree.
genuine human interaction, because we have mirror neurons, and I'm learning from a
Sure.
genuine interaction, and it's different. Like my brain knows that that is not like I'm not building a connection with an actor on the screen, right? It's different me watching an actor emulate an emotion versus like me connecting with you and having a real interaction.
Mhm.
So like I know acting is not AI yet, but like
Right.
it's still a very different thing when somebody is on a screen and I have to guess what's going on. I don't have enough context. I can't ask enough questions to make sure I understand the full spectrum, and the idea of just knowing exactly how you're feeling from a facial expression or how you're expressing your behavior. We know scientifically that your behavior is not indicative of your emotional state. Everybody is going to express themselves a little bit differently. So but from a resource standpoint, I love the Calm app. I love those types of tools. Podcasts are amazing. Is there anybody that you're listening to that's been really helpful and insightful for you?
maybe a little bit less in the EI space, but I think somebody you know as well, Dr. Angelique Adams from UT, the
Yeah.
Mastering Engineering Leadership podcast. Because what I love is she does bring in the things, and I got to talk to her, and we ended up talking about storytelling, for engineers,
Yeah.
and how powerful that is, and that's also a big part of EI and EQ is getting people to care about whatever it is that you're that you're passionate about. And she talks to so many interesting people, and all different kinds of perspectives. So that's one I've been listening more to.
Awesome.
And of
Yeah.
course yourself, obviously.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I
And
also,
congrats for Harvard. Yeah.
yes.
Speaking at Harvard, I mean, holy smokes.
Thank you. Yes, it was a dream come true. I have to like pinch myself a little bit about it.
Yeah,
So thank
that's
you. And
awesome.
yes, I also was a guest on Dr. Angelique's. That's actually like why I've started this. I had so much fun and I had so many people just like reach out and say they heard that episode and I was like, you know what? Why not? Let's make one of my own. And I want to talk to all of my friends all of the
Right.
time, talk about fun things and answer philosophical questions. Why not? So I agree 10,000%. Check out Mastering Engineering Leadership podcast. That's an amazing resource. Well, cool. Well, thank you, Chris, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for going down a fun tangent with me. And thank you for making me feel better about HR and the fun gray area that you guys have to live in. I definitely feel a lot more informed and I have less negative feelings. I'll put it that way. I feel better, more good things towards HR after this conversation. So thank you for that.
Good. My job is done. They won't revoke all my HR credentials. And I'm not saying that everybody in HR is great. It's like every other function. There's some better than others, but
Fair. Fair.
but no,
Well,
I
thank you
definitely
for,
appreciate the wide ranging topics we got to cover, and uh, thank you for having me.
yeah, of course.